Hey guys, it's really good to see you again. I know it's only been 4 days since you saw me. 2 days? 3 days?
4 days.
2 days? It feels like an eternity. I miss you guys so much. So, as I mentioned when we were all hanging out on Monday, this week starts what's going to end up being 5 different guest lecturers who are going to join me for the first hour to an hour and a half of the class. And I think you guys should think about these guest lectures as really being kind of 2 parts, right? So on its face of it, I'm going to bring you a bunch of experts who really have deep expertise in storytelling, particularly visual storytelling. The flip side of this is that I've hand-selected all of them to help you guys learn skills that should directly help you solve problems that you guys have when you're out in the field. So let's be very transparent. The problem that when you're done hearing Emily and I talk today that Emily should have given you some tips on is how to move from having a topic to having a story. So when we talk about that, and that came up a lot in our pitches last week, right, which is part of why I scheduled Emily to be the first. So a topic is something like a vet who has returned home from war, or a neighborhood that's undergoing gentrification. So those are interesting, right, but they're not stories yet. They're just general topics. And Emily, who is the story editor in the graphics department here at the Post, runs a team who hangs out in that space constantly. And so a big part of what she does is figure out how to take something that is a topic and turn it into a really compelling story with a lot of rich reporting, etc. Make sense? All right. So Emily, so you know, this is a class of West Virginia students. They are mostly undergrad with a few graduate students. We've been meeting for about a month and a half now, and I have 2 co-instructors, David, who you saw previously, yep, and Nancy, who's also in the room, and then also, hey, there's Nancy over there. Hey guys, good to see the second table. And Denise, who unfortunately I think was not able to join us this evening. She's the other co-presenter like me. She's based in Pittsburgh at the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette.
Cool. Well, I'm excited to hang out with you guys virtually. Quite literally.
All right, so Emily, let's get started. Why don't you tell us your name, your title, and how long you've been at the Post?
So my name is Emily Chow. My title is now Story Team Editor, which is a little bit nebulous, and I can explain a little bit more about what that means shortly. And I started at the Post about, I'm nearing my 4-year anniversary at the Post when I joined as a graphics editor, which simply meant I was a graphics reporter, developer, designer. It's like our entry level on our team.
And how did you get the job at the Post?
I interned here. So no better way to convince a company that I am worth hiring except showing them 3 months of good work, I guess, question mark. I have serious imposter syndrome, which you'll realize in the course of talking and listening to me talk to Phoebe. But I interned here while I was still in school. I went to Northwestern University, and I went back to school, got a phone call from my editor who I worked with, and they had an open position. So they hired me right before the 2012 presidential election.
So internships, guys. Huge plug for internships. You'll make a lot of connections, which will really be valuable to you going forward. So can you tell us what a somewhat typical day in your life here at the Post looks like?
Okay, so backstory would be what the story team does. And so this is a new team that we kind of put in place about, officially and formally, about 6 months ago, actually. It hasn't even been a year. But we've been doing this type of work for a really long time. And so the official restructure was kind of just taking advantage of real people and making it their focus and concentration and day-to-day task to do these types of projects. And by that I mean any project that sits outside of our kind of standard article template space of really thinking about how to integrate visuals, how to tell a different story that we've been calling an alternate story form that doesn't follow the traditional 500 to 1,000 word text that has accompanying photos and videos sort of situation. And so what that means for me on a day-to-day basis as the assignment editor and the person who's managing a tiny 4-person team is a whole lot of meetings and a whole lot of conversations that kind of start with like, hey, we have an idea, or like, hey, we want to do something cool around Zika, which is like quite relevant to my life right now. And then kind of this big question mark where we have reporters and editors who are on the ground all the time, reading, breathing, reporting on this stuff. And so we do a lot of mind melding and trying to figure out what is that interesting story we want to tell. Like, are there interesting characters that we can focus in on? What's that story that, an angle actually, what is that angle in that entire story, an ongoing news event that we can highlight in a different way than what our reporters are already doing and churning out kind of on like a daily high metabolism basis. And so I am like pro mid to long term game where you can like ship out something that's really impactful and interesting that kind of just like lets people take a step back. But that's not to say that all of our projects fall under that kind of a time frame or scale. So lots of meetings on a day-to-day basis, lots of time spent in a text editor programming, lots of time spent looking at InDesign comps and wireframes and just like thinking about how people consume our news on mobile. Yeah.
So that's interesting. If we can go back, so you say that people will bring you a topic like Zika, and part of what you'll do is help them figure out the story angle. So when you're in a meeting with an editor or a reporter, what kinds of questions do you ask to help them get to away from a topic that's in the news and into something that maybe you could assign to someone to work on and be a story?
What are the types of questions I ask? It's interesting. I don't actually know if I ask a lot of questions from the outset. I feel like what I end up doing is trying to consume a lot of the information that's kind of coming to me and understanding not only what we've published, but what the conversations behind what we've published have been, and then seeing if there are opportunities there to seek. And that's not to say that questions aren't helpful. I think that's just kind of like right now in the state of this newsroom and where we are, that to me has been the most productive way for me to try to carve out that path, is like really listening and understanding and doing a lot of reflection and then saying, hey, like, have we done this yet? Or like, okay, like now we're too in the weeds and now you're assuming that everybody's been reading about Zika 24/7, which not everybody has. Like, what is that story we haven't tackled yet? Because I think we're making assumptions that people are very well versed. And then it's like Zika 101 or something. Like, I don't really know. But it's a lot of that, and then asking, I don't know, like I like talking to reporters and seeing what they've learned on the trail or learned on any of their trips, because I think sometimes there are moments there that they don't realize can translate into something different. And
when you're talking with an editor, right, so it sounds like, to sum up, one of the things that you do is figure out what stories they've already told on the subject. And then you also ask reporters to tell you the story of how they've reported out a story, right? Sort of the reporter's notebooks, right?
Yeah.
The behind-the-scenes scenes and anecdotes that might be interesting. When you're listening to that, are there any flags that you look for that you think, okay, that's going to be a good story for a photograph, or that's going to be a good story for audio, or that's going to be a good story for video?
Phoebe knows this. I'm all about voices. Phoebe's all about voices. I feel we're really into that like user-generated space, or not even user-generated, but like how do we elevate stories, right? Because I think we do this in different ways. Like, we've written like long features, enterprise profiles. We have done the big picture, like huge summation of any topic. But there's something interesting to be said about letting people's voices speak, and the like emotion and connection that I think we can make with readers on that level, if it's an interesting enough story, if it's compelling enough, if hearing these people's voices, stories in their own voices, is compelling enough. Those are moments I feel like are awesome, because I think there's something more to just seeing like a name in a story. Like, there's like a video opportunity there, or there's an audio opportunity there. Really anything. I feel like anything can translate. I think there's so much that you can do visually that takes on a different type of emotion and takes a story into a different space and brings it to life in a way that sometimes text can always do, but text can do sometimes. And I think that like weird nebulous space is fun.
So one of the things that I've already showed you guys that Emily was a part of is the Waypoint project, which I know I stuck into our Slack a while ago. And David, I don't know how many screens are available, if you guys can pull it up while we're talking, or I know there's many laptops in the room, so maybe you guys can also just pull it up on your laptops. But if you search either in Slack or just Google the Waypoint, the Washington Post, you'll pull that up. So Emily was one of the editors, and it was really her team who kind of helped realize that story. And it's, I'd say, from my perspective at least, kind of the most recent in a long line of stories where Emily's team, which is thinking about story forms, and the video team, which is largely just thinking about going out and getting great video, have collaborated to build something bigger than what either one of our departments could have done alone. And that traces back to a project Emily and I worked on a really long time ago, which mapped cherry blossoms all over the Washington, D.C. region. And, then went into this full canvas, lush video photo experience, which is the Waypoint. So there's a lot of interest here for me in that. And I'd also say this is kind of a note for you guys to think about, that collaborating on something that can be really small bore helps you form relationships as a journalist, which can then translate into much bigger, more ambitious projects going forward. So if we're looking at the Waypoint, I'm curious to hear you talk a little bit about how you took this story from a location, which was the island of Lesbos, which is just off the coast of Greece, and turn it into a narrative story that people could go through. And I should just kind of caveat this, guys, that especially if you get to the end of the Waypoint, Emily, as amazing as she is not the only person, right? So she is kind of speaking about the experiences of an entire team of people here. But she really was very high touch with the whole thing, which is part of why I pulled her in to talk to you about this.
So the idea started from, I think, a lot of just like reading the news and reading a lot of what's been going on out there. And Samuel Granados, who is the deputy, what is his title? He's the deputy graphics director. So he's like second in command in our entire team. He was reading a lot about it, and he was like, there's something here that's being told, but it's being told in pockets, and he wanted to experience it to understand what more there is to this migrant experience and this whole refugee crisis that's going on. It was a huge year for us in 2015 about reporting, on everything that's been going on. And he took that idea and he kind of like went to different people in the pockets of the newsroom to bounce the idea off, and everybody seemed really excited about it. The foreign team was totally game. He reached out to Zoanne Murphy on the video team and was like, hey, I have this idea. Like, just wanted to like get some more perspective on it and see if there's anything else that I'm missing from understanding this experience and understanding what possibilities will be on the ground when I go. And she was like totally excited. She, before working at the Post, did a lot of work in the refugee space. And so she got on board, and the two of them went for a week and a half. Mm-hmm. Yeah. They went for a week and a half, and they mainly just went to go photograph everything and just document everything. And the key part I feel like that's exciting to me for this particular project is that there's been so much extensive reporting on it that we actually approached this project and said, blank slate. Like, you don't have a strong angle, you don't have anything. Just go out there and experience what's going on out there and what it's like, and learn it and understand it, and we'll come back and we'll reevaluate everything that you filmed, you photographed, you reported on out there, and we'll try to figure out what story to tell. And
so you really put the reporting first.
Yeah.
Okay, and then without having a story form.
Yeah.
So that's kind of an interesting reversed way of some of what we've talked about, right? Really going out and saying we're going to gather the material.
Yeah, and I would say that like the opportunity that we had to do this is very different from like, we've had other projects that have taken shape in totally different ways, and like taking story form first and then understanding better how to photograph and shoot things. And we'll talk about some of the lessons that we learned in doing this. But that was fun, and it was exciting, and it was also very daunting because they came back with like gigabytes of data, and they were like crashing their own computers because they couldn't download all the information that they got out there, and they were like, we don't know what to do. We didn't know that we want to do 360. We were excited about the possibility of doing that, and so we kind of like geared Sam up and Zoanne up with like all the 360 gear so they can go shoot that stuff. You'll notice none of it made it in to the project.
This is actually a great moment, and I'm thrilled that we're telling you this story. So you guys were hands-on with the rig. It was the exact same rig that you guys were shooting with this weekend. Anybody want to take a guess as to what we did wrong in the field so that that footage was all of it rendered unusable?
List all the things that went wrong.
Didn't keep track of like the clip numbers.
Can somebody turn us so we can see who's talking?
Go for it.
You didn't.
Yes.
You could hot seat.
Yeah.
First one on the hot
You
seat.
didn't keep track of like the clip numbers to make sure they were matching on the rig.
That was an issue, but that was not what sunk our 360 footage. Next person.
Next guess. Who was in Phoebe's group?
It'd have to be fatal. It'd have to be
Go for it, Aaron. Just
Aaron's got it. Aaron's got it. Maybe. All right, let's see.
Mine has it.
If I had candy, I could try to.
Here we go.
Yeah, we just throw you candy.
Okay, so was it? Was it because it was on photo instead of video?
No, but good guess. Good guess. Although you're getting warmer.
Like, can I have a second guess?
Yep.
yeah.
Yeah.
Second guess. Were like resolution, frame rate, stuff different for each camera?
Yeah, not quite, but
Keep
what
going.
we did wrong is, do you remember the diagram that Ben drew on the board, right? About making sure that you were shooting in 4:3, not 16:9?
Yeah.
Everything was shot in 4:3.
Or wait.
Yep.
16 by
Or
9?
69.
Or 16:9. See?
Everything? Like all the cameras?
All the cameras consistently. So we were consistently wrong,
Consistently wrong.
Yeah.
but across the board.
So what's the issue with that? Like you have some gaps in your stitching, like some black space, I'm assuming, or it doesn't. Yeah.
So it actually can't stitch together at the end.
Oh man.
So I mean, like, to dial back, because I totally forgot that we did this, is like, we walked in, we were like, okay, we want to do a bunch of stuff, but like, let's try to shoot some 360 video. And we went out there and we shot it, and we're like, okay, we're going to come back and we're going to think about like how to play with this space and create like a Google map experience of like, you know, letting people see all the different parts of this island and what the process is to like travel. And then we were like, after like a half a week of looking at the assets, and Phoebe and her team was like, yeah, no, that's not happening. And we're like, okay, reevaluate.
Yep.
Like, what else can we do? And it's not to say that there wasn't good footage. Like, there was amazing stuff to work with. And that's almost like the excitement of over-reporting. Although there were plenty of editors in-house who had to like kill a few darlings and make sure that we didn't just like drown a reader in information so they never actually understood the story. So that was an experience. Yeah. So you're close.
You were very close. You were very close. So that's interesting. I'm going to talk about what else they gathered out in the field. So we tried to shoot 360. What else did we do?
360. There were a lot of interviews on camera with different folks. A lot of scene setting. You know, kind of like the big wide-angle views of all the different scenes. And also, Sam went in there intentionally knowing that he wanted to do kind of like the B-roll moving image feel. So he did a lot of that, some of which we used. And he also did the thing, okay, where, you know how like you have those moving portraits where like the eyes blink, or like, you know, there's like subtle movement but the portrait is still there. So he wanted to do a lot of that, even though nobody knew he was doing it. So they would like pose, and then he would just like let the camera keep rolling, and they would just be like, are we done? Like, so there was a lot of that, which I think was like, you know, they're like faces of migrants, and they're faces of people who are traveling, and so it was really lovely, but there was like so much of it that we really needed to just cut down on assets. He also did a really cool thing. If you dive deep enough into the entire story, there's a part where he printed out a piece of paper. And he drew like 2 lines, and he drew one person, and he asked people to visually draw who they were leaving behind, who they were with, and then who they were like waiting to see, and then ask them like, there was like a packet of them, and so that was one of the ones that we used a lot of. And there were also like, how much did you spend traveling by boat, by walking, by vehicle, like how much money have you spent? So there were a lot of different diagrams like that he was using to interact with the humans out there, to just figure out what their experience and journey has been like. And that was really cool because that was not a thing that I think I would have thought of if I were taking ownership of the reporting. And it was really exciting to see that come back because then you have like, you have these like hand-drawn stories that they were telling people, and especially when there's a language barrier, sometimes I think that was a really helpful and interesting way to kind of get past that. What else was there?
Well, there was a lot of, I can speak for Zoanne, who was the video journalist who went on that. She also, and I'm sure Sam did this as well, but they would ask for footage from their interview subjects.
That's right.
Right? So just in the same way that we all have our phones, many of the migrants also had cell phones. So there's one point in that project where you see really compelling video that was taken by one of the migrants on one of the boats.
Yeah.
So we can take you into a story in a place that we couldn't even get to.
And Sam actually, I think, at some point handed over his gear, which, we can ask whether or not that was okay from Washington Post insurance standard.
That's a very Nancy move, getting really ambitious with your gear, putting it in dangerous situations.
So he handed it to these photographers, they were photographers by trade, and so they walked around with his camera and took a bunch of photos, and then found some setting where it shot video and then stopped in a still frame, which we ended up using too. So it was kind of cool to see what and in his mind it was what are they seeing, and what does their experience look like if it's not seen from my perspective, and so that was really awesome.
Yeah.
But yeah, that just meant a huge data dump and a huge kind of beast to tackle. So there was a lot of storyboarding initially and just having a conversation of what can we show that's different from what's already out there, what all the stories that have already run, all the stories that we have run as a company, and kind of by the nature of what we've been doing, we have a strong sense of people, there are kind of two big buckets that I like to think of, which is a purely exploratory project from a graphics and visual presentation perspective, and there's the purely kind of explanatory perspective, right? And so one I consider a linear space, and one is a little bit more 360-esque, where you just throw somebody into some experience, and you let them take away whatever information they want from that piece. And then there's and that's a scale, right? It's a sliding spectrum, and I think I always qualify and try to classify how much a story falls in one bucket versus the other, or how much it kind of merges both, which to me is the most ideal, because we as storytellers by nature, I think, like to see a beginning, middle, and end. But in the face of the internet, in the digital age, if you can't get that person to the end of your story, hopefully they walk away with some information, because people don't have a lot of time, and their time attention spans are pretty limited. And so that's kind of the reason why we ended up creating the setup that we did, which is there's the skim of getting all the information you can, but every once in a while, if you want to dive deeper into one piece, you say do you want to get to know Shade's family? And you say yes. It actually dives you deeper in, and then it actually takes you back up and lets you continue on. So it's a little bit choose your own adventure, but not really, because we are kind of doing a little bit of a mind trick, which is we never actually take you off the narrative. We just take you on a slight detour that takes you back onto the same road.
So that's interesting. That actually gets into my next question, which is, you've got all this material that they come back with. You put it in some semblance of order. What did it look like when you tried to start organizing it into that narrative?
I have a picture of Zoanne and Sam sitting in our 8th floor kitchen, literally with printed out sheets of all their different frames, and that really long table. It was all over that, and it was just a lot of that. A lot of physically taking pieces and understanding what fits where. And there was a little bit of category kind of, I think for the sake of digesting the reporting too, but also in crafting the narrative, there were categories that were clearly formed, which is okay, there's the island. There are these certain areas on the island where certain things are happening, which is the registration process, waiting for paperwork. There are the camps that people are living in. There is the physical travel and landing on the island. There is the actual departure, and how that differs, because they're showing up in rubber dinghies, and then they're leaving on these fancy ferries. And And so those were kind of like natural buckets that the information started to fall into. And then the question really was, how do we surface all those different buckets in a cohesive narrative that would carry a person through so that they continue to be engaged such that they will see the departure from the island and start with the arrival of the island. And so there was a little bit of, we talked about it, and we're like, maybe we should do location-based, like, so that we, like, take you physically through a map, or, like, maybe we talk more about it from a one single migrant's perspective, to like, issue much of a reduction approach of just saying that one person's experience typifies an entire, population of migrants' experiences. So they were kind of like different, like, classic go-to structures that we tried to explore, I think, with the information. And that was kind of when we started asking those questions, which is like, if people can't get to the end, what do we do? Like, how do we surface enough information that they continue to carry through, but we know we have a lot, and we know we want to put a lot in front of these people. How do we not make that, like, how do we make an experience that feels seamless and not cumbersome, so that, like, to me, those are the best experiences that we ever work on, which is the one that's not obtrusive. Like, you let that content sing for itself.
So that's interesting. I mean, if we can kind of pause and draw this back to sort of thinking about how to construct a story, that idea of focusing on what assets you have, trying to think about location, characters, and then also going back to your reader and where you want them to end at the end.
Yeah.
Or where they can acceptably leave the story.
Yeah, it's like a little bit of both.
Did you have a goal? Like, you were like, okay, I want the reader to at least get to this?
No, I don't think so. I don't think we really had a goal. But I don't know. I feel like as like a journalist in this day and age, you kind of have to have an acceptance of, like, how, I don't know, we talk about it all the time in this newsroom in terms of metrics of, like, how far, like, how much of a percentage of, like, a story has a human read. Yeah. And I feel like that's just, like, an acceptance that we have to come to, and an interesting kind of, like, from a designer and developer perspective, an interesting user experience, user interface design challenge, which is, like, how do you convince people that an entire story is worth going through? And that doesn't have to translate in just a design sense. Like, that's just narrative, right? Like, we have to have an acceptance that maybe somebody's not going to watch. Like, I'm assuming everybody in here watches videos because you're in this class. But, like, at what point do you get bored? You know what I mean? Like, at what point do you, like, switch open the next tab and you're, like, logging onto Facebook or checking your email while, like, letting that audio ride in the background and pretending that you're actually still committed and listening to the entire thing? I think these are questions that we have to ask ourselves when you start to see how you behave with the news that you're reading and how that should translate to the process in developing your own work, that you're putting out there onto the internet.
How far do you let yourself get in story planning before you put it in front of somebody who hasn't been involved and say, what do you think? Or how far do you get in this?
Work in progress. Our motto has been, on my team at least, early and often, just because with all the things that I've said just now, there's a caveat that I'm making a set of assumptions, and I don't know if that's true, right? Like, there are a lot of users on the internet. Everybody behaves with it differently. I can make a set of assumptions and say, hey, I don't like to do X, Y, and Z, or I see that so-and-so doesn't like to do X, Y, and Z. But it's not until, I don't know, you kind of have to, like, test those things and make sure that you're going down the right path before you go so far that you're like, not willing to give, and you're like, oh, well, too late. Like, I can't turn back now. I can't just scrap everything and just, like, start over again, which is a totally different part of the process.
No, absolutely. So, this project was an example where you had Sam, who was on your team, and you had Zoanne. So 2 different departments, and even though we're friendly, they have sort of different goals, right? Zoanne is really trying to tell visual stories, and you guys are really trying to tell graphic stories? Sure. How do you approach that collaboration? Which I wish Denise were here, because Denise talks a lot about sort of, and I'm sure we'll get into this in a future class, right? But when she's assigning a photographer to go out and shoot a story with a print reporter or what have you, what that dynamic looks like. So I'm curious from your perspective about some best practices that you've learned when you're collaborating on one story but two different reporters or departments.
I feel like based on observation, being incredibly open-minded and communication is always key. Like in terms of the reporting and planning process, I think to think of each other as kind of like forging that path together is different than saying so and so had this idea and I'm like following this person in part of like in aiding that process. And it's a slight nuanced difference, but I think it's key, right? Like I think Zoanne walks into a project having a certain set of ideas. Sam walks into a project having a certain set of ideas. They have totally different ideas and they're totally valid. And it's trying to like having the communication and the patience and also the open-mindedness to walk somebody through your process, but also be willing to listen to theirs kind of creates a very interesting, exciting end product that a single person couldn't have done themselves. But, you know, some of it kind of starts to feel like over-communication, which I never actually think is a bad thing. But I think it's fun because I think it also, like, trains, I don't know, it means that, like, because of all the questions I learned, all the questions I asked and all the things I learned from the previous project, I am now thinking about things differently when I'm going into my next project. And I can have better conversations in the future with people about exploring possibilities and seeing, like, what else we can do. Yeah. Part of it also, and I don't know how this is like a personal preference thing, I think, is like not showing your work early and often and being willing to not over edit before you put it in front of someone. You know, and I think part of that is like showing the process, but also saying, hey, like, here's all this interesting stuff I shot, and before I choose to actively edit it, like, let's have a conversation and see if you see something differently than what I saw, and maybe there's something I can work with there that I just didn't think of. Like, I think there's an interesting conversation that can happen there pre-editing or, like, during editing. Yeah.
That makes sense. That makes a lot of sense. So let's get specific to this class, which is, you know, part of what we're trying to solve as a challenge in this class is using 360 video to tell stories and using it out in the field. So why, when you're trying to put together a shooting plan for a project, do you say, let's try to grab 360 video for this?
I don't feel like I personally know a whole lot about 360 video yet and exactly who interacts with it and how. And I feel like that's also kind of like that interesting question mark is one that I'm very interested in exploring because we just don't know enough about it. Like I think it's right now, I think, in that phase, I think, where it's so cool that people are more interested in the technology than the actual story it's telling. And like once we get into that space where people can like focus on the content, like I'm interested in that space of saying like, okay, we're gonna like, how is that 360 video actually gonna truly elevate the story that we're trying to tell, the angle that we're trying to tackle, rather than somebody like picking up their phone and just like spinning around thinking it's really cool. And I think we are moving into that space slowly, but I'm interested to see where that goes. And I think that's also like, that's kind of to me marks the potential that 360 video has, because we've seen some cool projects out there. I think there are definitely more coming down the pipeline. But it has the ability, right? It has a little bit of the gaming experience ability of like moving into the exploratory space that I was speaking about, but putting you in a little bit of a first-person view, and that's interesting. Like, there have been different ways that we've tried to do that with standard video, with standard photo, features that we write, but I think it's different and somewhat scary to be a journalist and say that you're going to give up a little bit of that power of guiding the narrative and saying, let's see what people learn. Like, let's see what people learn by just like taking this thing that I edited and exploring it however they want. I don't know. 360 video is fun.
So if it's fun, then what are the downfalls of 360?
Giving away that power of crafting the narrative. Kind of like, I think because it's in that new tech space, you know, I'm nervous that we're thinking about it more as a new, cool, shiny thing than we are thinking about it as thinking about it consistently as a way to enhance the story that we're trying to tell. That's almost what's scary about it, is like, I think there's a space for it, just like there's a space for any kind of other medium that we're exploring in storytelling. But it has to be used right and it has to be done right in order for it to be effective. And I mean, yeah, giving away a little of that power and just being like, here's this thing that we're kind of just put in front of you. You can like learn and take away any information you want, right? And I think that's a big question mark from an editing perspective, from a framing perspective, from how people are going to consume it once it's published on a page.
Makes sense. So when you're, to kind of go back to the story place, you're working on a story and you're trying to figure out what tools to use to tell the story. How do you do that?
You do that.
Putting me on. That's good. That's good. I usually think about the eventual narrative that I'm going to craft, even if like that narrative doesn't end up being the one that I'm going to tell. And I try to make sure that every tool I'm planning on using has a place. Right? Like if I'm trying to do an expose of something and I want to use a drone, like what is the drone going to do to help expose something? And I think especially with 360 or something like drones, I'm really thinking about the limitations of that technology. Like the drone, I'm going to have 25 minutes fly time max.
Yeah.
So if I can't gather footage that's going to like expose the fact that this woman is ripping out roses and planting tulips, there's no point, right? Like then the drone is just
hard-hitting.
It's a hard-hitting expose on this Thursday night. But something like that, that's where I sort of usually make my choice decisions.
It's interesting because I feel like my team does a very particular thing, which is like we live in the internet space and we design and develop and craft the presentation and how the presentation can enhance the story. That when I think about and also we're like by nature visual graphics thinkers, so I feel like when we think about what tools we're gonna use, they're fairly traditional in like the reporting aspects of things like that. I think that said, we live in a space where I think we can take advantage of a lot of the resources and brilliant minds are available at this company, and so I think we start asking ourselves questions, which is like, what is that interesting thing? Or like, what do I not know about this problem? Or like, oh, I wonder if, or like, wouldn't it be cool if? And then that kind of translates into, I wonder if so-and-so has information about that, or has the gear in order to shoot that thing, or has the means to tell that story, even if we aren't the ones who are directly going to tell it.
Oh, interesting. So you sort of approach it from the like...
That's how I think I approach it.
Okay. The question that you think they might have the gear to answer.
Yeah.
Okay. Interesting.
Yeah, and I mean, I think we all live in different spaces and like are interested in particular topics or conversations that are happening, and those things trigger questions. And then when I don't feel like, I don't know, I don't ever think I can do my job without all the millions of people that I work with. And so I never feel like I need to own a story. And so I love to hear what other people have to say about the question that I ask, or like whether or not they think it's something that there is worth pursuing, whether or not it includes me or not. And so I start from like a question-based space, I think, more than, yeah. I don't know.
If we go back again to sort of some of what they're dealing with right now with projects, and you think about yourself as a student journalist or an emerging journalist, right? How do you take a scale of a really ambitious project idea and turn it into something that you could actually execute in a smaller space?
I think I'm about to contradict myself. But in some way, it's like you have to think big and dream big in order to push your boundaries and like learn new technologies, learn new ways to tell that story. But on the other hand, I feel like it's also like know your limitations, like know what you're best at. And so like while I think that helps limit, right? Like I don't know, you're going to start working on projects and you're going to have deadlines. So that's going to change the scope, and you're going to be like, okay, well, what can I realistically do in X amount of days? That changes the scope a little bit. And then like, oh, well, you know, it would be really interesting if I could, I don't know, something, build a virtual reality app on my iPhone in order to experience this project. Like, but you realize that maybe you don't have the capacity to do that. I think project ideas and story ideas evolve from when you think big and be like, okay, well, maybe that's not the best because A, I don't know how to program in Swift or whatever iPhone apps are made out of these days. Maybe instead I can do this, and it could be like it could fundamentally have the structure and tone of what a VR project might do, but it's in the capacity of what I'm capable of doing. I don't know. I think it's like there's a little bit of both in the evolution.
So it's okay to dream really big, but then you have to, at some level, say, what can I actually execute on this deadline and with my skills?
Yeah. I think so. Or, like, I don't know, if you can find people who have the skills and who to help you out. That's the most exciting part, I think. But, I don't know, I think I come from a place where I always want to tell that really cool, big story, but then you're kind of going to enter that space, and I think any creative person falls into this space, which is like, oh, but if I do that, what if I also do this? And what if I also do that? And what if I also do that? And part of that is like going back to killing darlings. You know, like every project that I think I've personally launched and I've helped my team launch, we always wish we could do 5 more things with that thing. But we know what our limitations are. We know realistically there's a deadline. You know, you start asking questions, which is, what is the best product out there that will do everything that I wanted to do? And what's the thing that's like a nice to have, doesn't actually need to be there in order to tell that story? And then you have to like self-edit. I mean, I think that's part of it. Everybody has an editor, but I think it's also valuable to learn how to self-edit.
Well, I kind of want to turn this around, turn the mic around and get the hot seat going and get some questions from you guys. I can't stress how much Emily is a really formative editor. A lot of people in the room bring ideas big to small, and she helps them kind of go to the next level. So this is a great opportunity if you've got ideas of stuff that you're already thinking about pitching or working on. You can pitch her ideas, or you could just bring her questions about, you know, her past, how she got started, what her daily job is. I know you've got questions.
Please straighten this out.
I started by doing photography, by the way. That's a side backstory.
Started as a photographer. There we go.
What's up?
Come over to the hot seat.
Hot seat, Justin.
Come over to the hot seat.
It'll get the blood moving, guys. You'll be ready to go.
Have a line in the hot seat. You're going to be next just because you're the hot seat.
Hi, Emily.
Hello.
Okay, so I'll just like ask like a general question. what are like some of the most compelling stories that you see? Like, what are the things that really make a story just like, wow, that was amazing? That are things that, are things that inspire you, or things that make you want to learn a new skill, or and how do you keep up with that? Are you constantly reading, like?
Constantly. Yeah, I think there's like twofold, which is you come to terms with the fact that there's always constantly going to be a fear of missing out, and just being like, listen, the world is so big and I can only handle so much of it in my brain. Um, and I think the other part is like Phoebe sends me links all the time to really cool things, and I am always surfing the internet, and so every time I find something, it like anything big or small, I think for me, every time something is delightful, or I find myself feeling happy, or I find myself like reacting, right? There's like the second question that I ask as a creative, which is like, whoa, wait, like what happened there? Like why did I just react to that thing, right? And it's as it can be as small as like if I'm shopping online on the internet and somebody were like, to show me, like there's some sites have like a catwalk video, and they actually show like how the fabric moves. I'm like, oh my gosh, that was awesome. That was a question I genuinely had because I'm shopping on the internet and I can't actually see this in person. To things that I think, and I think everybody brings their own experiences into these types of into consuming any information. And so for me, if I see something and I'm like, whoa, like that page, even though I had a lot of really cool interactive video things, loaded really quickly. I wonder what technically they did in order to make that thing happen. Like that's a thing that I think about when I walk into a project, because speed and also iPhone data and mobile data is a thing that we have to care about these days. So it kind of ranges, but for me, I think it delight is a word I use a lot, and I think a lot of people that I work with hear a lot from me because I think there's something about that, right? It's like that tiny tick where you get really excited about something, or you see a narrative or footage of a protest that just really makes you stop for one split second in this crazy busy life of ours to say, what just happened? And that comes in anything big and small, and it comes from books. I'm pro going out and looking at things that are non-news. I think there are really interesting things going on in other spaces, in engineering, in the Silicon Valley, in art spaces. There are really cool, interesting, interactive art pieces happening in different exhibits all around the world that I think, have something that you can take away from it and say, how does that translate into the work that I know that I'm best at doing?
I think those are all great. We do talk a lot. We'll say, hey, check out. I know distinctly that I sent Emily this. It was a shopping site, and I was like, I love the way they handle, when I select something, how it moves me into, a quick view of that, which we think about a lot when you're sort of scanning a big story and thinking about all the different pieces. That user interaction, if it's intuitive and it's really quick, you steal from that, right? You steal from the best and, give credit and get excited about that.
Right? And, even, I don't know, when I'm scrolling Facebook and I'm like, why am I still on this an hour later? They've done something, right, that we're not thinking about because it's intuitive and a mind suck. What did they do there that's actually, kept my attention for way longer than I thought it would? And I think those questions can pop up in any type of space.
Or even in older spaces. I mean, my current obsession, as if you follow me on Twitter you may know about, is one of our writers who's been with the Post the longest. He's the longest running employee of the Washington Post and was known for sort of doing spot news reporting, particularly on deadline, particularly to fill a set copy space, right? So they would tell him how many inches, and he would sort of scan the stories that were available, do some reporting, and write up a quick report. And what's so interesting to me, we recently, they had a whole party for him and pulled up all of these old clips that he had done, and his style hasn't changed that much. And it feels, when you read his stuff, like he is writing for the internet right now. I mean, they could be Snapchat stories. They're so well architected and put together. So, and he rarely uses photos. It's only a great headline, great story structure, great flow. But that's just as inspirational to me in putting together a video story as, even though it has no actual visual roots, right? But very much to Emily's point of like digging into that question of like what delights, what sucks me in, why did I laugh when I finished reading this? Why did I immediately want everyone else to read it?
And random, but if anybody has never read Design of Everyday Things by Don Norman, it's a wonderful book, and it also makes you question every single thing that you have ever like touched or experienced in your lifetime, including like why. I mean, one of his core things when he starts this book is like why is an office phone so complicated? Like it is needlessly complicated. There's a number of buttons that you have to hit in order to do anything. And I feel like that really that was one of the first books I read where it took me into a really like personally reflective space where I don't know, I constantly ask myself why anything. Yeah, but inspiration can be found anywhere.
Cool. Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else?
She's next.
Natalie got Natalie? Yeah.
I love this. There's a line. It's right.
Hi.
Hello.
So I guess my question for you is, how did you kind of transition from a photographer to more graphic design and kind of graphic storytelling?
Incredibly organically. So I picked up a camera basically in high school and was always photographing everything, and I really enjoyed it. I had an advisor who had like a previous career before he was a teacher as a photographer. So I think it was really inspiring to have that support and like have that training. And then so I walked into J school being like, I'm going to do photojournalism. And then I walked in the program and I was like, oh, Medill doesn't have a photojournalism program, right? And so you kind of have to like, I had to take advantage of the classes that were available, but then also just like take a lot of different assignments with different publications and start shooting and doing different things. But in the process, I was also like, oh, I remember vaguely enjoying designing magazine layout, you know, and like let me like pick up some of that on the side just to like broaden my portfolio and do more things that I can handle in a given day. And in the process of doing all of that, I met a few people who kind of like broadened my eyes and the scope of possibility, which was like I was a photographer for this one publication on campus called North by Northwestern, and I met the guy who like built the site. Like it was a very young site. It was like 3 years old. It was competing with our daily paper, and he had built the site, and he was like doing all these really cool things in Adobe Flash, if anybody talks about that in school. And I was like, oh, like this is a thing that people can do. Like it never crossed my mind, and it wasn't until I started seeing things and then thinking about what I was seeing on the internet as a thing that a journalist could build was when I was like, can you teach me how to code? And so like, you know, that was a thing that happened outside of classes technically, but was a thing that I started thinking about a lot. So I feel like that also means that at a baseline that I'm just a very visual thinker, and so it didn't have to just be photography. But I think organically I found myself gravitating more, sadly, to my computer and like sitting there and coding than I felt comfortable being on the ground, photographing events or shooting portraits or things like that. No, it was just like, I don't know, it was like a thing that I enjoyed more, so I just kept doing it. But I like to think that kind of the things that I picked up while I was a photographer and those experiences have still helped me be a better collaborator when I'm working with folks in our newsroom. So, thanks.
Yeah. All right. I'll warm the seat up some.
Bring her stuff.
So you kind of touched a little bit on it, and basically, like you told us like what to do to get your viewers, but like what and like keep your viewers and how you like think about that. But like once, how do you analyze? Like, do you look at what worked and what didn't work, and then say like, hey, we're gonna use Twitter for this next time to promote this versus like, what do you do?
A lot of that. So we do a lot of, we need to be better at it, honestly. I feel like there's always improvement to be made in that area. But every time we build something, right, like we're tracking page views and page numbers and all that traffic stuff that everybody talks about. And we see kind of, to some degree, what industry folks are saying about our projects on social media. But that's less important to me than, like, who is genuinely interested and engaged as a reader. What we've been doing more of, too, is, like, you know, just adding a little bit more tracking. So, like, my team will actually say, hey, like, we're going to introduce a button. So that means that inherently we might be hiding information, and when you click on that button, something shows up. We're going to track how many people click that button, because nobody's clicking it, like,
yeah.
what's the point? And so we've been doing a lot more of that, which is like, oh, I wonder who's using arrow keys to scroll and navigate websites as opposed to their mouse, or like clicking on arrow icons that exist on the page. And so we've been doing a lot of that to better understand what's working and what's not, testing our assumptions. What else do we do?
Do you like look at phone versus like on the web? Is there a way that you can tell? Okay.
Yeah, we also track that over time, right? So I know when users are on their desktop and when that number crosses over, right? So they start on their phones in the morning, then they get to the office and they're on their desktop, and increasingly also on their phone. So it used to like dip really a lot on phones during the day, and then like 5 p.m. the lines like reconverge, you know, and they get back on their phones and they're not on their computers anymore.
Cool. Yeah. A lot of, I mean, part of it is like guesswork still, but like a lot of it is like getting that data and getting enough of it to make like a coherent conclusion to test our assumptions.
And we also do some sort of like early predictive, right? So
Yeah.
like if we're thinking about using Twitter, right, to your point, and Twitter is going to be the way we ask people to comment or talk about this story. Before we make a choice like that, we're going to look at our communities and the community of readers we're hoping to hit with a story, and make sure we understand how they're using it. And that can help inform the ways we make it shareable, right? So if we know people are sharing a lot of images on Twitter, right, that might change the way we think about that Twitter share, or like where we let you share off different images. And you can see that, right? Have you ever been to Medium?
Yeah.
So do you notice how they offer you like a little highlighter that shows you the most like commented on or like shared or selected text? Right, so they're sort of taking to a natural progression the fact that they knew that people were sharing out snippets or chunks of their stories, right, and highlighting it for you in there. So you didn't have to go to Twitter to find that out. You could just look right there. And it becomes like a new kind of pull quote, right? If the old pull quote was like pulling out this amazing quote and like bumping up the font and doing a nice layout so it was in the middle of your story, so then instead you're like pre-highlighting text for one of your readers.
Yeah.
So those are all the way. And you test assumptions, and like sometimes you fail, but you have to be good-natured about that, right?
Yeah, there's this willingness to fail that has to occur. Patience, too.
It's a good question, though. Oh, wait, you know what? I want to tack something up on the end of your question while you're sitting there. Don't leave the hot seat yet. Which I think is also key as you guys are thinking about sort of organizing your projects, which is also scope limiting in terms of what you're trying to track or accomplish. And we will definitely talk about this a lot, right? Like there's only so many, I can't assume that my project's going to be like great on Tumblr, a hit on Twitter, and people are also going to use Instagram to copy to like pick a lane and then stay in your lane. You know, there's only so much that you can accomplish. And that's a difficult conversation to have, I think. We struggle with that at the Post.
You want to do it all.
Everything.
Who's next?
I have a question since nobody's in the hot seat. So just, and you can talk about the Waypoint or any of your projects. Like, I'm over here. Sorry. I guess I should get in the hot seat, right? Can you talk like specifically with the Waypoint or with any of your projects? What did you learn as far as like user experience, how people were interacting with it? I noticed that the mobile versus desktop is really different for that. What were the takeaways that you?
So this is like a carryover from galleries, I think, but we kind of knew this, which was, and I kind of spoke to it before, which is like not a lot of people are getting to the end, right? So in terms of if you look at a progression, I count slide 1 as like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. The number just slowly starts dipping, right? And then it tails off. So like people start off strong and then they're like, all right, you know, what else is? So we kind of knew that based on like all this experience that we've had with like embedding galleries in our articles and pages. And so that was almost part of the reason why we were like, okay, well, how do we continue to engage, right? What we learned is that I think on slide 3 or 4 is when we asked the first yes or no question, most everyone hit yes, which was really cool to see, right? And part of that is like, oh, somebody probably doesn't know, and like the way that the question is framed and that content is framed, it's like you better feel some guilt if you like don't want to learn more about how they get onto the island. That was really cool. We also learned that engagement overall was really deep. Like the average time spent on the entire project was super long, relative to other projects we worked on of the same scale. And what else did we learn? The mobile thing, that was what I wanted to circle back to. We knew walking into the project that there were kind of some limitations about how video plays on devices, right? So on iPhone, you know how you have to like actively opt in to play anything and it pops out in like the native player? We didn't want that to happen. And so we explored a bunch of different technology actually before settling on the static one, which was like, how do we make that thing play in view? It is not obtrusive. It's not like a second tap in order to get that more information that we want to deliver. After much exploration, none of that really worked out, and we were like, maybe we should go with a static approach. And part of that is also because we are kind of, you know, especially with devices now, we're basically like asking people to give us their data plan. And like the amount of videos that we load in that process was, we did a calculation before we actually switched to static, and it was like half a gigabyte, right? And like, I don't want any reader calling me up or calling anyone up or Jeff Bezos up being like, yo, pay for my phone bill, you know? And so like, there are considerations there in terms of like genuinely, right? And that feeds into the user behavior thing, is like, if it takes that long to load that video, or if it takes that long to load any of those things, we're not really doing our readers a service, even though we genuinely think that it's really awesome content that we really want people to see. And we had that concession. It was like super late at night before we published, which was like, okay, the static version, we had already started building out the static version. It was actually only for iPhones before, and then we like slowly put more things in that bucket in terms of Android devices and different things, and we were like, okay, the static version still works well. It's not, I think, to me as like wow, but it's also still a very comprehensive story, and it's like faster. It's faster to load. It's lighter on people's like data plans, and so there were all these different considerations that had to happen, and somewhat of a concession, but I think everybody was still really proud of it, and that was like an active conversation that happened at like an ungodly hour, in order for us to make that decision. But yeah, I don't know. I think it was interesting. I think it was exciting to me. The most exciting thing I think was that people were hitting yes, because I kind of made a default assumption that was like, no one wants to. But we didn't really, you know, there's no kind of wireframe sitemap for anyone out there that's like, oh, this is what it does. Like, this is what you're missing, and like, this is, I don't know.
Hot seat.
Better watch out. Dana's going to hop in this hot seat if nobody else does. Ooh. I know she's hiding on the corner. Oh, there we go.
So coding and stuff like that has been something I've been recently kind of always interested in, and I just want to know like how you get started in creating an interactive website like this. Not just content-wise, but like the actual website.
Yes. start off small and like take one question you have, which is like, and I'm talking like small, like micro, which is like, I wonder if I can make, this is maybe too basic, but I'm going to go really basic here, which is like, I wonder if I can make that like line of text hyperlinked such that it jumps off .com. Like, I'm talking about breaking down. So when I first started, you know, you have an idea for a project, right? And you're like, oh my gosh, I really want to do this thing. This takes patience and this takes a lot of learning, which is like breaking down that entire project into like tiny, tiny little tasks in which you can have tiny wins in between and also continue to learn from it. So then you're like, okay, I conquered the hyperlink. Sweet, right? Like, next thing is like, how do I make that button, when I hover over it, it changes colors? Like something like, I'm talking like super task oriented. And I think to some degree that also helps psychologically, because I think it makes things feel less daunting. And I think the tiny wins are really, really key, because I think it's really easy, I think, to, especially when you're kind of like running down, you know, walking in the dark, you don't really know what you're getting yourself into. You don't really know the right questions to ask it. And so it's really, for me at least, because I internalize a lot of things, is like, it was not that difficult for me to be like, I don't know what I'm doing. Like, why am I failing so hard? And that to be a very like heavy emotional space to be in, that keeps you from learning. There are some really cool sites out there that have like free tutorials, which are like really good starts, but those also are kind of like things that walk you through a language maybe, and then, you know, you still have to, I personally think that coming from a project space is helpful, because then you actually walk away with an end product. And I started with like my own website, and one thing that I know some of my colleagues do when they teach classes is like, their project is like building a resume online, you know, like how do you make that format layout that you have on a one-page printed thing on the internet, because already that in itself is scary, and then you have to be like, oh, okay, somebody's going to view this on the phone, so like I have to, you know, and so there's like all these different questions that you ask, but that's one where like, A, you'll learn a lot, and then B, you're going to walk away with, your resume that you can actually like link to, which is helpful, and it's a product to be proud of. But tiny, tiny steps, and I think the tutorials are a good way to start, but to me at some point I was just like, I need to pick up a project and just be like, I'm interested in making this thing. And that in school literally was like a 6-card panel in Flash, where anytime you hovered over one of those panels, text showed up. And that was all it was. You know, and that was like, cool, I made something. Like, that's awesome. And so, you know, baby steps.
Do you think it's easier to start out with like manipulating code that's already written and then work into like writing your own?
Yeah, definitely. I don't feel like, it wasn't until I had a summer-long part-time internship where I was writing it for like 22 hours a week that I felt comfortable writing code from scratch. Like, I spent probably 2.5 years Googling, opening up 5 different tabs, being like, no, I think this is the one that I think wants, like, does what I want it to do with like a little bit of like extra, and then like I'll go in there and hack away. To some degree, like, I know there's an argument that can be made for like learning certain fundamentals so that you're smarter about finding the proper solutions, but I think there's also a lot to be said about trial and error, and just getting your hands dirty and not getting too far in your head and just like doing something.
Okay. Cool. Thank you.
Other questions? See movement off camera. Got Emily for another 15 minutes. Set her free, but that seems like a waste.
Now I'm gonna ask now.
There we go.
All right, but now I have to go over the why. So, all right, well,
Hi.
I want to follow up on David's question, and you know, so you learned that people click the yes button. So how are you now gonna test that further? What's your next steps from what you learned from that project in the next projects?
So we're gonna do, and we're actually going to do it again shortly. So it's going to be a similar template, totally different content piece, and I think it'll be interesting to say, I think it's interesting to take a piece that's worked and translate it into different stories and see, at least from our end, how well that form works. Because I think putting it out in one piece and in one particular context doesn't actually tell me enough about how well it worked and what parts of it worked and what parts of it didn't. So we're going to do it again, more or less with the same structure of like the yes or no, asking different questions because it's a totally different content piece, and seeing if that works, right? I think from there are kind of interesting things to do that I would be excited about, which is like if I were to, in that one specific example that you're describing is like if I were to say, if that 360 dream worked out, like if I were to say like, do you want to experience what life is like traveling on a boat? And they were to click yes, and it were to like enter you into like a 360 experience where you would like literally be rocking on a boat and you could spin around and see these folks sitting around next to you, like that would be interesting. I would be curious if people would know what they're getting into and investing in when they hit the button yes, not knowing exactly what their return is. And
then
like that.
To tie that back to like our editing conversations with Ben, right? If we did that, so one of the things Ben brought up in our training was figuring out what's at the center of the shot when your person lands in the 360 experience. So then having that conversation, if Emily comes back to us and is like, okay, I want to try this, then changing the stitch so that it makes sense. And then also I would need to collaborate with you about sort of where my horizon was, because I would want whatever the user came from, that still photograph where they answered the question, I wouldn't want them to like drop, right, or go up. I would want them to like equally go through.
Yeah, and so I think there's a lot of different opportunity there, and that was just like the one implementation that we decided on for this particular project. That there's like, what is the return? Like, what else can somebody answer yes to, or like, what if instead of framing yes or no, we were to say two different things, and like, instead of doing a thing where it takes you back in just a detour, we were to like do a fork and do a little bit like more of a literal choose your own adventure. Like I think there are a lot of different direction that we could take that thing in and just see.
What do you think keeps you, or are you doing forks? I mean, I can hear the argument in the newsroom with somebody saying, but no, they forked from my story and mine's not going to be shown and they'll never get to see it. How did they get back there? And it's like, well, no, they chose to go left instead of right.
That power.
Yeah, that power.
Yeah, and that's part of the reason why we ended up settling on like the one structure that we did, right? Because we knew that was going to be a concern and a question, and to some degree, it was like us not willing to give up a little bit of that power by pretending to give users the power, but then like being like, no, just kidding, you're really on the same track. It's and also kind of from a production and editing standpoint, when you have multiple forks and you don't really know where else it's going to go or when it's going to return and converge, that's like a lot more reporting that has to be done, or a lot more, at least, thought that has to be put into all those different forks depending on what assumptions you're making, what has so-and-so learned so far down the road. And I just don't think we had that kind of time frame in order to do that. Yeah. But yeah, I mean, it's all about like giving up control. Just being like,
that's right. Other questions? Somebody else want?
Anybody have a story pitch or a refinement from a previous pitch that they want to pitch to Emily and get her thoughts on?
Even if it's like half-baked, quarter-baked.
Yeah, it's quarter-baked. Eighth-baked.
Emily is definitely used to quarter-baked ideas. I bring a lot of quarter-baked ideas to Emily's desk.
I'm quarter-baked.
People leaning forward.
Any cool project you've seen on the internet that you think I haven't seen yet?
Sure. Go for it.
Here I am again. Hello.
Hi.
So I'm doing a story in my other class about female veterans. It's going to be a photo story. That's kind of all I have. Right, I have my subject. So I mean, yeah, I have my subject so far. but we haven't started photographing yet. So I guess in terms of forming a plan to kind of photograph efficiently, what would you give for that, I guess?
Do you know how much time you're going to spend with?
Oh, I have 6 to 8 weeks with this girl.
Whoa.
Yeah, it's a long-term documentary.
I don't know. I mean, I think part of it has to come with research and kind of setting. Like, I think there's never a true harm. There's some harm. There's never any like huge harm in setting some assumptions about what you potentially will hope to capture or what you think you might learn from this person, but being also incredibly open-minded about like what other possibilities are out there and not, I know I did this and I know I think I still do this, which is like you have your mindset on something and then like anything that like doesn't confirm that, you're like, no. Like,
Yeah.
like I got one path and I'm going. I think, you know, having certain set of structures, like I mean, if you're doing a photo story on a female vet, I think a lot of it would be just simply like revealing some of that day to day, right? Like, what is it like to be a female veteran? What does it mean now? Like, what is she still struggling with?
Mm-hmm.
What are some experiences that she had then that still stick with her today? And those are kind of, sorry.
Yeah. Sorry. I was just, like, my big question is, I guess, what are the main differences between female veterans coming home and male veterans coming home? Because there are differences and they're not necessarily illustrated in the media.
Yeah.
I went to a really touching, it was a very eye-opening conference where this woman who was a veteran, she came home, but not only did she come home with kind of the PTSD of being on the battlefront, she was also sexually assaulted by one of her officers. And that's kind of something that male veterans don't tend to face, statistically speaking. So it's kind of like something I want to kind of illustrate in the story, that they feel this isolation towards their male peers because they get treated so differently when they're in service.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think those are interesting threads to explore and kind of like questions to ask, right? It's not to say that the subject that you're going to be working with may have experienced those types of things, but that's almost the power of photography, and almost the challenge of it is like capturing the emotion, you know, in the answers that you're going to get in a way. You're like translating their voice in a visual sense, and I think that's
the hardest part.
But it's also very beautiful. It's very powerful. Like from a photography perspective, like being open-minded about maybe like clipping a bunch of things. Like, I wonder if you have a potential to do like not like stop motion, but stop motion-esque sort of experiences in order to create movement and like something that's dynamic that can't come across in a specific photo. Like, there's so many different, like, I think photo editing opportunities, not photo editing, photo shooting opportunities that you have there in terms of like shutter, light, all those basic things, but also thinking about, like, I am also, because of the graphic space, pro small multiples, and I think there's something really powerful about like seeing a bunch of like a repetition in form in different things and like seeing how that translates, and that could be, you know, something interesting to come of that, or nothing at all. I don't know. I have to like.
Yeah, I guess in terms of having experience with being on the street, you know, and talking to people, what's the best way to kind of create a form of intimacy or trust with the subject that you're doing?
That's a good one. It's been a really long time since I've done.
Yeah, I figured you were in the graphic field, so I didn't know if.
Field reporting? Yeah, I'm like usually the person who's sitting in front of my computer.
Yeah.
In denial. People have different approaches, I think, that work differently. And I think some of it kind of like speaks to your character and your personality. Because like for me, I've always been like a sit back and like observe, ask questions, be very open about what I don't know and what I want to know or what I want to learn, and creating that space.
Mm-hmm.
I love silence because it makes people awkward, but then it makes them talk more, right? Or it makes them do certain things, and then also like, I mean, and that's a challenge with photography. Is like you also eventually want to like disappear and become invisible, and that takes time. That just takes kind of like building that relationship and sharing pieces of yourself, but also like knowing that there is a relationship that you have to maintain, which is that you are the reporter.
I sometimes like to let them do something while I'm interviewing them. I did an interview of a woman for a project I worked on with Emily a few years ago, and I pre-interviewed her, and it so happened that like her day was running behind, so she was driving, and I was on like speakerphone, and the interview was amazing because she was distracted by the fact that she was driving, so she didn't overthink her answers. And then when I went back with the shooter who was shooting the story, we tried to recreate that,
was, like, totally
and she was like so awkward, and it was like a lot of unusable film. So there was something to be said for like keeping her a little distracted, and she got better even when we went under her office space, right? And she was sort of like, puttering around doing things. She got more natural in a way.
Yeah, I guess the hard thing that I have trouble doing is my subjects, when I have them, they don't necessarily realize what they're doing is important. So if they're welcoming their father who's visiting from Tennessee or something like that, they don't necessarily tell me that that's happening. I guess even though I try to accentuate to them that I need to be part of these seemingly mundane parts of their life, I'm just kind of curious how you can kind of, because I feel like sometimes I'm pushing myself on them, so to speak. How do you kind of find that balance of being there when these moments happen and letting them kind of keep you up to date with their schedule without seeming too pushy?
You're in a tough situation because you're still in school, so you still have to go to classes.
Yeah,
Otherwise, I would be like, just be like, hey, can I spend a day with you? And just like, you don't have to change up anything. I'm just gonna like hang out with you and see where things go. And doing what you can. And I think part of that is like understanding if you have limitations and you may not capture that moment, that there are probably like 1,000 more that you have an opportunity to capture. And there's always going to be that moment in any reporting process where you're like, oh my gosh, I wish I got, and that's just part of it. That's just part of the reporting process. I think the scheduling is hard. I think maybe I don't know.
We should, you know what? Honestly, we should ask Denise about this.
Yeah.
Just because she's doing a lot more assigning and has done. She's still so close to field work. I don't know. I feel like the most effective people that I've seen in terms of getting that proximity and that closeness have manners for miles. That's like what I've noticed, right? They are just so thorough and just have like a respectful patter of like both putting people at ease. It's not about sort of like lying or playing a confidence game. It's just about like, I don't know, manners is the only way that I can say it, right? Like I associate it very much with like growing up in the South where you're just like, okay, wow, like knocking you over with a feather of politeness and just like staying out of your way and like thanking them for their time. And that like kind of eases people, right? Because I mean, what are we all afraid of? We're afraid we look like fools, especially when you put a camera in front of somebody.
Yeah, that's the hardest thing is getting them kind of relieving their tensions. It's like, I don't need you to be this, something you're not, but then they feel like they have to be something, and then I feel like it discourages them from doing the story. So it's like trying to make them feel comfortable, like, I'm not here, I don't exist, don't pay attention to me kind of thing. But I guess
But the flip side of that is being like, I am here, and I really appreciate your time and letting me be around, Then you're just sort of being confident in your, like, space that you're taking up, and expressing your appreciation for them, I think, can help kind of put people at a little bit of ease.
Okay, well, I hope I'm not taking up too much of the hot seat. Does anyone have?
Justin, I saw you raising your hand in the back, like you had a question.
It was more just like to add on because what you were talking about, Natalie, with your story kind of reminded me of this. So back whenever like the Bill Cosby thing, and all of the women came forward who had the allegations against him, and they made, for New York Magazine, they did that whole photo
I saw that.
with all the women in chairs. They did an Instagram piece that went along with that, and it was still photos of the women, and they had overlaid audio recording a part of the interview. And so it was kind of an interesting way to portray the women as the strong individuals that they are, rather than showing like a video of them in an interview talking about a subject that might make them come off as very vulnerable. They had a photo that was very powerful, and the audio was overlaid, and I think it was really effective, an effective way to like get it perspective from their own voice and to lend validity to their stories and what they were going through.
Yeah, I really liked that. I think so, yeah. I saw I don't know if she showed us the Instagram part though, but she definitely showed us the Time magazine.
Yeah, it's the same story.
It's the same story, yeah. It's just an Instagram, like, go along with it kind of.
Yeah. Especially with the, like, the 14 seconds that you have on Instagram TV.
Right, yeah.
So you can make
so just
the, like,
short
the
audio
important
clips.
14 seconds. Yeah. So.
Wait, one last caution for you. Start logging your footage as soon as you shoot it. Especially if you're talking about something that's going to last 6 weeks or 8 weeks. Because that'll serve you two things, right? That'll help you discover those patterns and those small multiples that Emily's talking about. You'll start to see it emerge in your work. Mm-hmm. And then also, otherwise you end up at the end and it's just like
a big beast of a thing that you have to...
Yeah, oh yeah. Mm-hmm. Okay, well, thank you guys.
Can you describe exactly what you mean with logging the footage? How detailed do you have your logs, and how are you logging it?
Whew. I mean, you can go real detailed if you want. I like to encourage people to log footage in a way that makes sense to them, but is also understandable to the outside world. Does that make sense? Like, it should be a high enough barrier that you're collecting some information on the footage and, like, get the basics, right? You need time, date, who, where. All of that needs to be gathered. I might take it a step further and say, like, if you're, let's stick with this female vets project, right? Let's say some early things that you're playing with. And actually, this goes back to the way Emily was talking about waypoint, right? So if one of your early tensions is, like, you're thinking maybe about organizing it in terms of geography, but you're also maybe thinking about it in terms of like a human interaction, right? So maybe I would start tagging my footage and it would be like hospital, coffee shop, house, mom's house, right? And I would carry those tags all the way through, but I would simultaneously be tagging all my footage so that it was like smile, handshake, cringe, purchase, or something like that, so that then I can start to see the patterns that emerge in both of those. And even though I'm over-tagging, it'll give me more to work with later on.
Your future self will thank you.
Yeah, in terms of your footage. But and then again, I often think about, like, okay, so but all my basic information there should be something that if, like, God forbid I get pulled off onto another project, Emily could take this over and, like, she might not have formatted her dates that way, but it's understandable to her. So.
And just real basically, where are you tracking that and logging that? How are you doing that? In, like, what form?
I mean, again, like, ease of use. I would probably use a Google Doc myself because I know it would be accessible on my home computer and my work computer. But that Google Doc might just be a key to folders on my hard drive, right? And I'm on a Mac. I like the color coding, so I might do some color coding with my folders as well. I'd pick a file naming convention if I was going to, like, convert all my RAWs to having specific names. And I would stick with that throughout so that it was really easy to find my files. Also knowing that those file names, more likely than not, carry through to your end published project. So make sure they're legible and, you know, respectful in their naming conventions.
So I think that some of that organization, even if we see it from a couple of different people, might be good for groups organizing on project here to not have to reinvent it, but look at some of the different ones that people do.
Oh, totally, totally. I'm super happy to show you guys, and now may not be the best time to do it because I'm not quite sure how to do this. We should organize a screen share. But going back in time, I showed, like, I talked to you guys early on about the N-word project, and Emily also worked on that project. So when we logged all the footage for that, we went through, like, I can distinctly remember at least 5 different spreadsheets of footage logging, and then we would get to a point with one where we would jump to like a slightly cleaner version, but that would still like pull and key to that old version. One where we were tracking names, one where we were tracking what they were coded, one where it was like a different page where it was keyed into that. And the most important thing was that we were like, to Emily's point of like over communicating about how we were logging stuff and the ways in which we were logging it. What else have you and I worked on where we organized or logged footage? I put together a shooting schedule for Cherry Blossoms, which was one of our first projects we worked on together, where we had people go out and shoot scenes of cherry blossoms.
We are in a hard spreadsheet space. We love our spreadsheets.
I love spreadsheets more than Google Docs, as Nancy and David have learned. Like, the class syllabus that I wrote for this class is in a Google Doc, which surprises Emily not at all, because it's like my safest place is to like copy and paste cells and have them all sort out with formulas and be able to like grid them out.
But yeah, also kind of like when I mentioned that your future self will thank you, and there are a certain set of emotions and experiences that you comprehend or digest when right after an experience happens, right after you get done with reporting, right after you walk out of a meeting, right after you walk out of class. And there are things I think that are like choice that you want to remember later, but you might not be able to remember that unless it was logged somewhere. And I say this now, maybe you'll experience in the future, which is like the more you work with other people and the more you jump from company to company or other sort of situations like that, your future colleagues will also thank you if you leave a lot of information about a project that you did. I'm all about the documentation space.
One follow-up on this: do you do much time coding and logging when you're out there on the shoot? Like, I'm interviewing you and as you're making notes, putting time codes in your notebook so it's easy to find stuff. You don't have to watch the whole.
Yeah, I'll log a lot with my phone just because it's easy and it's there, and that way I can use both, right? Like if I have time, I'll type it in, but if I'm like pressed or I don't have enough hands, I'll also record a voice memo, and that way I can just capture the audio of something, and then translate it into something later.
Yeah, so occasionally I feel like as long as it's not distracting me from being invested in the conversation that's happening, sometimes I will. I've also worked on different projects where we do like annotated transcripts where on a development standpoint it's very helpful to know when a paragraph starts and ends, and so it's helpful. State of the Union is a good example of that. Is like literally sitting there and just like logging everything while it's going, just so you don't have a backlog of work. It's very easy to say I'm going to do that stuff later, and then when you have hours and hours of footage, not know where to start.
Something I did a lot when I was just a print reporter is I would record my interviews, but I would also have a notebook and be like I would be looking at my recorder and seeing where I was and be jotting notes like 45, 50 work experience with male supervisor, and that was just enough to remind me to go back and listen to that section of tape, even though I was leaning on my tape to be able to actually pull quotes. And I would also be sort of trying to take shorthands of quotes as I was going, which saved me more than once, right, where my recorder didn't work and I at least had like key quotes. I didn't have everything, but I had something.
Thank you. Anybody else? Hot seat?
All right, guys, this is it. It's your final moments with Emily. All right, I'm going to let Emily go. Why don't we thank her with a round of applause?
Yeah. Oh, wait.
Hands up.
Hands up.
Can you hear me from over here?
Yes.
All right, great. So, not that I was, stalking you or anything, but when I went to find, the Waypoint documentary, your name popped up, on your thing there, and then your little resume thing came up, too. So, like, how did you get involved with DataKind?
Oh.
Do you do that? It seems interesting. Talk about that. What is this?
So DataKind is a kind of like data science for good non-profit organization situation. DC has, so like, you know, when I talk about the fact that I do graphics, I got into graphics, so we do like data viz, maps, charts, anything that's clean data, anything that's exploratory, explanatory, illustrations. This team is, at the Post, is now like 22 at large, and is like, you know, there are a lot of skill sets. But that's also to say that the DC community, there's a huge data science DC community that exists because there's like policymakers and all these different people doing like research and education. And so my roommate at the time was like, hey, I just went to a hackathon 2 weekends ago before you moved to DC, and we're doing like a follow-up to make this like interactive map for this non-profit organization. And I was like, sure, I'm new in town, so I'm going to go meet people and do a thing that I feel like I'm confident in helping contribute to. So we got involved there, and it was just a bunch of really cool people who are interested in pairing data scientists, data visualization folks with nonprofits who may not have the full resources in order to do the things that they want to do. It's a really cool organization. The guy who started it quit his job at the New York Times in research and started this crazy thing, and it's all over now. It's like in a bunch of different cities with multiple chapters. But it was cool. I mean, it was like one of the first things I did when I came to DC, and I met a bunch of different people who work outside of the news space, but also do similar things. And that was also kind of like it was like a knowledge share where it's like, oh, that's how you look at that interesting problem that I don't know about. But it was like tangentially related, which is why I got involved. And mainly my involvement was specifically with DC Action for Children, which is like a nonprofit that sits in DC. Yeah.
Cool. Thanks for sharing.
All right, guys, one more round of applause for Emily.
Thank you.
And maybe we should give you guys and come back in